Imagine a world where your life revolves around money, wealth, cars, houses, all of it at your fingertips. It's the dream, right? But what if, one day, all that power and success collided with something you couldn't control, something raw, human, and deeply personal? Lily was just 10 years old, but life had forced her to grow up faster than most kids her age. In her small, dusty town, she lived in a cramped, old apartment that had seen better days. Her mother, Sarah, once vibrant and full of life, had been bedridden for months. Suffering from an illness that seemed to drain her energy day by day, Sarah could no longer work, leaving Lily to carry the weight of responsibility. The town was small enough for everyone to know each other's business, yet no one seemed to notice the quiet suffering unfolding in that little apartment. Lily, with her wide, hopeful eyes, had a determination about her that didn't quite match her young age. She had a mind that refused to give up, even though they had no money, and the market seemed unforgiving for someone like her. Their house barely stood together, but it was the only home she knew, and she held onto it for dear life. Every morning, Lily would wake up before dawn, making her way through the streets, always thinking about what small things she could do to help her mother. She would pass by the bigger houses in town, the ones that seemed like they belonged to a different world. Mr. James Sterling, the richest man in town, lived in one of those houses, a massive estate that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Sterling was known for his wealth, but not for his warmth. He had more cars than Lily could count and lived in a mansion that had more rooms than she could imagine. Yet for all his wealth, there was something missing in his life, something that money, mind, and market couldn't fill. James Sterling had built his fortune in the stock market, always focused on making the next deal, the next big comeback, the next acquisition. He was a powerful man who believed the world could be conquered if one just knew the right moves. But despite all the apartments he owned, all the wealth he'd accumulated, Sterling felt strangely disconnected from the world around him. His house, despite its grandeur, often felt empty. While he drove his sleek car to various business meetings, never missing an opportunity to discuss wealth or money, he rarely took the time to notice the people who walked by, the struggles of those around him. The local market was just another place to invest for him, another asset to control. Lily, on the other hand, couldn't care less about markets or money. Her focus was on something much more basic: survival. With her mother too weak to work, Lily had taken it upon herself to try and gather what little they needed to make it through each day. The local market, filled with the smells of fresh bread and the chatter of busy shoppers, was both a lifeline and a source of dread for her. She knew everyone there, but they also knew her, and her situation had made her a target of pity and sometimes disdain. There was no wealth in her world, no exciting stories of comeback, just the raw reality of trying to keep her mother alive. It was an endless cycle of hope and suffering. Mr. Sterling, with all his mind focused on business, never noticed Lily in the crowd, never noticed her wandering the market stalls with a desperation hidden behind her innocent face. He was always busy, always too preoccupied with his wealth and real estate investments. Yet their lives were about to intersect in the most dramatic way possible. Lily, with no options left, had become desperate. The house they lived in was falling apart, and with every breath her mother took, the weight on her young shoulders grew heavier. Sterling's market investments were thriving, but little did he know that a single moment in that same market would change his life forever. Sarah, lying in her small, creaky bed, could do nothing but watch her daughter struggle. Her once beautiful hair had thinned out, and her bright smile had faded into a look of constant pain. She tried her best to encourage Lily, to give her hope, but the truth was, she was terrified of what the future held. They had no money for proper medical treatment, no car to get around, and no family left to rely on. All they had was each other, and even that bond was being tested by their relentless suffering. Sarah worried constantly about what would happen to Lily if she didn't make it. She had heard stories about kids ending up in the system, and it broke her heart to think of Lily living in an unfamiliar apartment or house without her. Lily's routine was relentless. After school, she would stop by the local grocery store, carefully eyeing what she could afford with the little change she had scraped together. Sometimes she would find something left over that the vendors were willing to part with, but most days it wasn't enough. The pressure was mounting, and the little girl's mind was always racing with thoughts of how to get by. She wasn't supposed to be the one worrying about wealth, money, or the market, yet there she was, alone in a world that seemed so much bigger than her. James Sterling, on the other side of town, never thought about people like Lily. His life was filled with contracts, high-rise apartments, and international business deals. He had a mind for success, a mind for money, but the human element of his work seemed to elude him. His conversations revolved around the next deal, the next house he could flip, or the next car he could buy. He didn't realize that in his own town, a drama much more exciting and real than any business deal was unfolding, a dry. Whether he liked it or not, his wealth, as vast as it was, would soon be challenged by something he couldn't buy, human connection. The two worlds of Lily and Mr. Sterling seemed galaxies apart, yet they were tied by a single thread of fate. For all his wealth, Sterling had never experienced suffering the way Lily had. He knew the suffering of a bad investment or a market crash, but he didn't know the suffering of wondering whether you'd have enough money to buy bread for your sick mother. He didn't know the kind of drama that unfolded in the small, suffocating rooms of a rundown house, where hope was a fragile thing, barely holding on. Yet, in that small market, surrounded by fresh produce and the bustle of everyday life, these two lives were about to collide in a way that neither of them could have predicted. One morning, as Lily rushed through the market, her mind focused on finding something, anything to take back home, she crossed paths with Mr. Sterling. In that moment, their worlds collided, and what unfolded next would change the course of both their lives. It was a moment where suffering met wealth, where drama became real, and where hope, though dim, found a way to fight back. It was a chilly morning, the kind that made the air feel sharp, as Lily pulled her thin coat tighter around her small frame. She made her way to the market, hoping to find something cheap enough to bring home to her mother. Her mind raced with thoughts of how little time they had left before the landlord would come knocking again, demanding rent. But today, the market felt different. There was an unusual tension in the air. As she reached for a loaf of bread from one of the stalls, her heart sank when she realized she didn't have enough money. She hesitated, her hand lingering over the bread, knowing that without it, her mother wouldn't eat today. In that brief moment, desperation took over, and before she could stop herself, she quickly grabbed the loaf and tucked it into her coat. Before Lily could make her escape, a strong hand gripped her shoulder. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. It was Mr. Sterling. He had been nearby, discussing some business opportunity at the market, when he saw the girl take the bread. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" His voice was sharp, cutting through the bustling noise of the market. Lily's stomach dropped. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her as Mr. Sterling accused her of theft. "You think you can just take whatever you want? I should call the police right now," he snapped, his tone cold and unyielding. For a moment, Lily could barely breathe, fear overtaking her as she struggled to find her words. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. It's just my mom." Lily's voice trembled as she spoke, trying to explain. But Mr. Sterling wasn't in the mood to listen. He crossed his arms, towering over her, his wealthy stature only amplifying the power imbalance between them. "I don't care about your excuses. Stealing is stealing. You can't just take what doesn't belong to you." The crowd, sensing the drama, had gathered closer, their murmurs filled with pity for the girl and disapproval for Mr. Sterling's harshness. Lily's mind raced, panic setting in. She didn't know how to make him understand that she wasn't just stealing for herself. She wasn't some street kid out to make trouble. She was trying to save her mother. Tears welled up in Lily's eyes as she pleaded with Mr. Sterling. "Please, you don't understand. My mom is sick. She hasn't eaten and we have no money left. I just needed something to bring home to her." Her voice cracked, and for the first time, Mr. Sterling noticed the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of responsibility far too heavy for such a young girl. But his pride was stronger than his compassion in that May, and he refused to soften. "That's no excuse," he said, though his words lacked the conviction they once held. Something about the desperation in Lily's voice gnawed at him, but he wasn't ready to admit it. "I should still call the police," he added, though his hand didn't move toward his phone. The tension in the air grew thicker, and the market crowd's whispers seemed to grow louder. Lily's heart raced, feeling trapped and exposed. She couldn't go to jail, not with her mother depending on her. She wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek and looked up at Mr. Sterling, her voice small but determined. "Please, I'll do anything. Just don't call the police. My mom, she needs me." Mr. Sterling hesitated for a moment, his hand loosening slightly on her shoulder, but his face remained stern. He wasn't used to being challenged by a child, especially not one in such a vulnerable position. The millionaire in him wanted to stay in control, to assert his authority. But something about this girl's suffering tugged at him. The market seemed to stand still, all eyes on the scene unfolding. "Leave," Mr. Sterling finally said, his voice low and cold. "But if I ever catch you stealing again, you won't get off this easy." He let go of her shoulder, pushing her back toward the edge of the crowd. Lily stumbled slightly, but quickly regained her footing, her breath catching in her throat. Without another word, she turned and fled, clutching the loaf of bread close to her chest, not daring to look back. The crowd slowly dispersed, some shaking their heads in disapproval of Mr. Sterling's behavior, while others looked on with sympathy for Lily. Mr. Sterling watched her disappear into the distance, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions he wasn't ready to face. As Lily ran back to her small apartment, her thoughts raced. She was grateful to have escaped the situation, but the guilt weighed heavily on her. She had never wanted to steal, but what choice did she have? Her mother was getting worse, and there was no other way to make sure she had food. Lily slowed her pace as she neared her home, catching her breath, her mind still reeling from the encounter. She pushed open the door to their cramped apartment, the weight of the world on her small shoulders. Her mother's weak voice called out from the bedroom, "Lily, is that you?" And Lily quickly wiped away the remnants of her tears, putting on a brave face. Mr. Sterling, on the other hand, couldn't shake the image of Lily's tear-filled eyes from his mind. That night, as he sat in his luxurious house, surrounded by wealth that once felt like an achievement, he found himself staring out the window, lost in thought. The market deal he had been so excited about earlier now seemed insignificant, as his mind replayed the scene over and over again. There had been something in Lily's voice, something raw and real, that had pierced through his usual indifference. His wealth and business success had never prepared him for this, a confrontation with a girl who had nothing but desperation in her heart. As he tried to focus on his next investment, thoughts of the little girl and her sick mother kept pulling him back. In his mind, Mr. Sterling had always believed that wealth could solve any problem. Money bought comfort, it bought success, it even bought him the luxurious life he'd always. But that encounter with Lily shook something in him. For the first time in a long while, he felt powerless in the face of someone else's suffering. The millionaire who had everything, houses, cars, money in the market, had no idea how to deal with the kind of desperation Lily had shown him. It was a problem he couldn't throw money at, and the more he tried to push it out of his mind, the more it gnawed at him. He had seen suffering before, but never so up close, never with a child so young. As the night grew darker, Mr. Sterling began to question himself. Had he been too harsh? Was there something more he could have done? The money he spent without a second thought could have easily bought the bread Lily had taken, and yet in that moment he had chosen to assert his power rather than offer help. He didn't want to admit it, but the guilt was growing, and it gnawed at him in a way that no market loss ever had. There was something deeply unsettling about knowing he had the power to make a difference, yet he had chosen not to. He didn't know why, but something told him this wouldn't be the last time he crossed paths with that little girl. Later that evening, Mr. Sterling sat alone in his grand dining room, the silence around him feeling more oppressive than usual. Despite the luxury of his surroundings, something about the encounter with Lily lingered in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of her desperate, pleading eyes. It wasn't just about the loaf of bread anymore. The look in her eyes had been more than just hunger. It was the kind of suffering that wealth couldn't touch. Mr. Sterling, for the first time in a long while, felt uneasy in his success. He pushed away his untouched dinner and stood up abruptly, the spaciousness of his house suddenly feeling like a hollow achievement. Something was gnawing at him, something he didn't understand yet. Unable to sleep that night, Mr. Sterling paced through the halls of his house, trying to make sense of the emotions bubbling up inside him. He had built his fortune by staying detached, focused, and always keeping his mind sharp. But now, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he found himself thinking about a little girl who had stolen a loaf of bread. It seemed ridiculous. He had dealt with much bigger problems in the market, with much more money on the line. Yet this felt different. There was a weight on his heart that hadn't been there before. By midnight, he could no longer ignore the growing sense of guilt. He needed to know more about the girl and her mother. The next morning, Mr. Sterling made some discreet inquiries around town. He asked people he trusted if they knew anything about a sick woman and her daughter, hoping to piece together their story. It didn't take long for the truth to come to light. He learned that Lily's mother, Sarah, had once been a beloved teacher at the local school before her illness had forced her into a bedridden state. Sarah had been a fixture of the community, known for her kindness and dedication, but ever since she had fallen ill, she had faded into the background, becoming one of the town's forgotten stories. The more Mr. Sterling learned, the heavier his heart became. Lily wasn't just a thief, she was a child trying to keep her family alive. Armed with this new knowledge, Mr. Sterling decided to visit Lily's home. He felt a strange mix of emotions, guilt, curiosity, and something else he couldn't quite name. As he approached the small, dilapidated house on the edge of town, he felt a pang of discomfort. The house was in stark contrast to his sprawling estate. It was small, barely holding itself together, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. He knocked softly on the door, unsure of what to expect. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and there stood Lily, her wide eyes filled with surprise and a touch of fear. "Mr. Sterling," she whispered, unsure of why he was there. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, feeling more out of place than he had ever felt before. "Lily, I wanted to see your mother," he said, his voice gentler than it had been in the market. Lily hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside to let him in. The inside of the house was even smaller than it had appeared from the air smelled faintly of illness, and there, lying on a worn-out bed, was Sarah. She looked up weakly as Mr. Sterling entered, her face pale but kind. "Mr. Sterling," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Lily stood by her mother's side, her eyes filled with both hope and caution, unsure of why the wealthy man had come to their home. As Mr. Sterling looked at Sarah, something inside him broke. This wasn't the world of wealth, money, and market shares that he was used to. This was raw, unfiltered human suffering. For a moment he didn't know what to say. All the confidence he carried in the boardroom, all the power he wielded in his business deals, felt meaningless in the face of this woman's quiet strength and her daughter's desperate love. "I'm sorry," Mr. Sterling finally said, the words catching in his throat. "I didn't understand. I didn't know." Sarah smiled weakly, her eyes filled with a kindness that seemed to make no sense, given her situation. "It's okay," she said softly. "You couldn't have known." Lily looked from her mother to Mr. Sterling, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the same man who had nearly called the police on her just days ago. Yet now he stood in their tiny living room, his face full of something she couldn't quite place. Regret, compassion. "I don't know why I came," Mr. Sterling admitted, his voice low, "but I couldn't stop thinking about you, about both of you." He looked around the smire, taking in the worn furniture, the cracked walls, the stark contrast to the life of wealth he had always known. "I can help," he said, more to himself than to them. "I should have helped before." There was a long pause as the weight of Mr. Sterling's words hung in the air. Lily's heart was racing, unsure if she could trust him, unsure if he meant what he was saying. But her mother, always the one to see the good in people, nodded slightly. "We'd be grateful for any help," she said, her voice soft but sincere. Mr. Sterling looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the walls he had built around himself start to crumble. This wasn't about money, wealth, or status. This was about something deeper, something he had lost sight of long ago. "I'll take care of everything," he said, his voice steady now. "The medical bills, the treatments, whatever you need." Lily's eyes filled with tears, and she quickly wiped them away. She had been so used to doing everything on her own, so used to fighting for every scrap, that the idea of someone stepping in to help felt almost unreal. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mr. Sterling, for the first time in his life, didn't feel like the powerful businessman he had always prided himself on being. Instead, he felt something much more profound. He felt human. As he looked at Sarah and Lily, he realized that this wasn't just about fixing their situation. This was about fixing himself, about finding a part of him that had been lost in his relentless pursuit of wealth. As he left the house that day, Mr. Sterling felt a strange sense of peace. He knew this was only the beginning of his journey with Lily and Sarah, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about markets or money. He wasn't thinking about his next big investment or how much wealth he could accumulate. Instead, he was thinking about a little girl who had stolen a loaf and a mother who had fought quietly for her daughter's survival. And for the first time, Mr. Sterling realized that maybe, just maybe, his life was about to change for the better. In the days that followed, Mr. Sterling kept his promise. True to his word, he made arrangements for Sarah to receive proper medical treatment, sparing no expense. The doctors were optimistic about her recovery now that she was receiving the care she needed. For Lily, it felt like a dream. One day, she was on the verge of losing everything, and now her mother was finally getting better. Still, there was a part of Lily that struggled to trust this sudden change. She had spent so long in survival mode that it was hard to let her guard down, even with Mr. Sterling's help. But as days turned into weeks, she began to see something different in him. He wasn't just a wealthy man anymore. He was becoming a part of their lives. Mr. Sterling visited Sarah and Lily regularly, checking in on their progress and spending time with them. Each visit chipped away at the walls he had built around his heart. He found himself genuinely caring about their well-being, not just out of guilt, but because he had grown attached to them. In his world of wealth and business, relationships had always been transactional, but this was different. He felt something he hadn't felt in years. connection. The days he spent with Lily, helping her with her schoolwork, or simply talking to Sarah about life, felt more fulfilling than any business deal he had ever closed. His house, with all its grandeur, had never felt as warm as their small, humble home. Sarah, too, noticed the change in Mr. Sterling. He was no longer the cold, distant figure she had once heard about from the townspeople. Instead, he was kind, attentive, and genuinely invested in their recovery. His presence had become a source of comfort for both her and Lily. There was something about his visits that made the house feel less lonely, less filled with the weight of illness and hardship. Sarah, despite her fragile health, found herself opening up to Mr. Sterling in ways she hadn't expected. They talked about the past, about her days as a teacher, and even about his childhood, which he rarely shared with anyone. Slowly, a bond was forming between them. For Mr. Sterling, these moments were transformative. He had spent so much of his life chasing wealth, success, and status, but here, in this small house with these two people, he found something far more valuable. He found peace. There were no contracts to sign, no markets to dominate, just human connection. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent his entire life thinking that money was the ultimate measure of success, but here, with Sarah and Lily, he realized that wealth had never brought him this kind of fulfillment. Every time he left their home, he felt lighter, as if he had shed a burden he didn't even know he was carrying. As Sarah's health improved, Lily began to trust Mr. Sterling more and more. She had seen him transform from the man who had once accused her of theft to someone she could rely on. It wasn't just the money he provided, it was his presence. He was there when she needed someone to help with her schoolwork, someone to talk to when the weight of caring for her mother became too much. Slowly, Lily began to see him as more than just a wealthy man. He was becoming part of their family, whether she realized it or not. And for Mr. Sterling, this was perhaps the most surprising part of all. He had always been so focused on his own wealth and success that he had never considered what it might feel like to truly belong to a family. One day, as they sat together in the hospital waiting room, Lily turned to Mr. Sterling and asked, "Why did you help us?" It was a question that had been ever since that day in the market. Mr. Sterling paused, considering his answer. "I don't really know," he admitted. "At first, I think it was guilt. I felt bad for what I said to you in the market. But after that, I don't know. I guess I just wanted to be there for you and your mom." Lily nodded slowly, understanding more than she let on. "I'm glad you did," she said quietly, her voice filled with sincerity. And in that moment, Mr. Sterling realized that he was, too. As Sarah grew stronger, so did her bond with Mr. Sterling. She had always been cautious, never wanting to rely on anyone but herself, especially after her husband had left them. But with Mr. Sterling it was different. He wasn't just helping out of obligation. He was genuinely invested in their lives. There were moments when Sarah caught him looking at her with an intensity she hadn't seen in years, and it made her heart race in a way she hadn't expected. Still, she tried to push those feelings aside. He was a millionaire, a man from a world so different from hers. What could he possibly want with someone like her? But Mr. Sterling's actions spoke louder than words. He wasn't just there for the dramatic moments. He was there for the quiet ones, too. He sat with Sarah during her treatments, brought Lily lunch when she had to stay late at school, and even helped fix things around their home. His presence was constant, reliable. Sarah couldn't help but wonder if, maybe, just maybe, this was more than just a passing act of kindness. Maybe, despite their different worlds, they were starting to form something real, a relationship built on trust, understanding, and something deeper that neither of them had the courage to name just yet. As the weeks passed, the town began to take notice of Mr. Sterling's frequent visits to Sarah's home. People whispered about the millionaire who had once been so distant, so disconnected from the community, now spending time with a woman who had nothing but her daughter. But Mr. Sterling didn't care about the gossip. For the first time in his life, he wasn't concerned with how others saw him. All that mattered was that he was there for Sarah and Lily. His wealth, his cars, his house, all of it seemed so insignificant compared to the time he spent with them. And in their small, simple home, he found a kind of wealth that money could never buy. One evening, as Mr. Sterling sat beside Sarah's bed, watching her rest after another day of treatment, he realized something that shook him to his core. He didn't want to just help Sarah and Lily. He wanted to be a part of their lives forever. The thought caught him off guard, but the more he sat with it, the more it made sense. He had found something with them that he hadn't found in all his years of chasing success. And for the first time in his life, he wanted to settle down, not with a house or an apartment, but with a family. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating, but it was the truth. He was falling in love, not just with Sarah, but with the life they could have together. After months of treatment, Sarah finally regained enough strength to return home. The day she walked through the door of their small house, supported by Lily on one side and Mr. Sterling on the other, felt like a triumph. The once sick and frail woman now stood with a renewed sense of hope, her body healed and her spirit lifted by the unwavering support of those around her. For Lily, it was a miracle she had barely dared to dream about. Her mother was not just alive, she was thriving. The weight that had rested on her young shoulders for so long seemed to finally lift, and she could breathe again. Their house, once a place of suffering, now felt like a home filled with possibility. Mr. Sterling had been there every step of the way, never wavering in his commitment to Sarah and Lily. He had watched Sarah's recovery with a mixture of pride and affection, realizing that this journey had changed him in ways he never thought possible. The man who had once prided himself on wealth and business success had found something far more valuable: love and belonging. In the quiet moments when Sarah would catch his eye or Lily would smile up at him with gratitude, he knew that he had found his place in their lives. No market, no money, no car or house could ever compare to the richness of what they had created together. As Sarah settled back into her life, she couldn't help but notice the way Mr. Sterling looked at her. It wasn't just the look of someone who had helped a friend in need. There was something deeper, something that made her heart race every time their eyes met. At first, she had pushed the feelings aside, telling herself that a man like him, so powerful, so wealthy, could never truly belong in her world. But as the weeks passed, and his presence remained constant, Sarah began to wonder if maybe she had been wrong. Maybe, despite their different lives, they had found something real, something that transcended wealth and status. One evening, as they sat together on the porch of Sarah's house, the sunset painting the sky in soft hues of pink and orange, Mr. Sterling finally found the courage to speak the words that had been building inside him for months. "Sarah," he began, his voice soft but steady, "I've spent my whole life chasing success. I've built a fortune, a life most people would envy, but none of it has ever made me feel the way I do when I'm with you and Lily." Sarah turned to him, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She had known this moment was coming, but hearing the words made it all the more real. "I never thought I'd find a place where I truly belonged," Mr. Sterling continued, his eyes locked on hers. "But I've found that with you. I don't just want to help you. I want to be with you. I want to build a life together, not because I feel obligated, but because I've fallen in love with you." Sarah's breath hitched, tears welling up in her eyes. She had been so focused on survival for so long that she hadn't let herself dream of love. But here it was, real, tangible, and standing right in front of her. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling, I never thought this could happen, but I've fallen in love with you too." The words hung in the air, both of them breathing in the weight of what had just been said. Mr. Sterling reached for Sarah's hand, holding it gently as if she might slip away. But she didn't. Instead, she leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder, letting the warmth of the moment wash over them. In that quiet space, with the world falling away around them, they found the peace they had both been searching for. For Mr. Sterling, it was a realization that wealth had never been the true measure of success. For Sarah, it was the recognition that love could come when she least expected it, transforming her life in ways she had never imagined. A few weeks later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, they stood together in front of a small group of friends and family, exchanging vows in a simple but beautiful ceremony. Lily stood proudly between them, a smile on her face that seemed to radiate pure joy. It wasn't the lavish wedding Mr. Sterling's wealth could have afforded, but it was perfect in its simplicity. The focus wasn't on wealth, money, or status. It was on the love that had grown between them, forged in the fires of suffering and hardship, but strong enough to withstand anything life could throw at them. As they exchanged rings, Mr. Sterling felt a sense of contentment he had never known before. Lily, watching her mother and Mr. Sterling say their vows, felt an overwhelming sense of happiness. She had been through so much, seen so much suffering, but now, standing here in this moment, she realized that hope had always been there, waiting for the right time to reveal itself. Her mind, once filled with fear and uncertainty, was now filled with dreams of the future, a future that included her mother's happiness and the love. Sterling. It wasn't about the wealth or the money anymore. It was about family, about the bond they had created that no amount of wealth could ever replace. As Mr. Sterling and Sarah shared their first kiss as husband and wife, the small gathering erupted in cheers and applause. For them, this was more than just a wedding. It was the culmination of a journey that had started with suffering, but ended in love and hope. The millionaire who had once been cold and disconnected had found his way back to, and Sarah, who had once believed she would never find happiness again, had discovered that love could come when she least expected it. Together, they had built a life that was richer than any market investment, any car or house. It was a life filled with love, connection, and the promise of a bright future. As the day came to a close, Lily found herself looking up at the stars, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Her mother was happy, her new stepfather was kind and loving, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't worried about what tomorrow would bring. They had come through the fire, and on the other side, they had found something far more valuable than wealth. They had found each other. And in that moment, Lily knew that no matter what challenges life threw their way, they would face them together, as a family. Have you ever judged someone before knowing their full story? What if the person you thought was in the wrong was actually the one who needed you? James Sterling thought he had it all figured out, but sometimes the real lessons in life come from the most unexpected places. What would you do if faced with the choice between wealth and human connection? Do you believe that money can solve every problem, or is there something deeper that truly drives happiness? If this story made you think twice about the way we judge others or how wealth plays into our lives, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel. Here, we share more stories that dive into personal journeys, life-changing experiences, and the dramatic moments that redefine who we are. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you won't miss out on the next powerful story that just might change the way you see the world.